Teste transmissão som 2 e testando transmissão som 2, teste A e teste.
Já abriram a reunião do Zoom? Posso ver aqui os participantes? Aqui eu tô gravando. Só... George Harvey. Right. I'll check. Essa reunião do Zoom, você tá mexendo. Só pra ver quem tá na reunião. Ah, tá. Você manda declaração, moço. Faça não. Não se preocupe, eu não ia mudar nem nada. Só queria ver quem está. Só queria ver quem está. Tipo assim, só tem a Mary, tipo assim, George Harvey. Não George Harvey. Hey, Rachel, does he have to leave?
No celular agora ainda.
Pois é, mas esse cara some, gente.
Recording in progress.
Eu vou dar stop aqui, aí para tentar iniciar no dela.
Recording stopped. Recording in progress.
Mas não vai áudio para você, não. Cortei tudo os outros.
¿Listo? ¿Listo? Perfecto. Uy, uy. ¿Listo?
Hello.
Uy. ¿Listo? ¿Listo?
Bom dia.
Bom dia. Bom dia.
Testando som.
Ok, bom dia e maravilhosa estar com todos vocês novamente hoje. Make sure that you have your translation device. We'll be spanning multiple languages for our panel this morning. Todo obrigada, Rodrigo, all the organizers, for all of the effort and work to be here, and a special thank you to my panelists, Vanda and Arnie, for joining us from around the world. This panel is to discuss the indigenous knowledge and rights of nature in responding to climate change. So I wanted to start first by talking about the word indigenous. It's been used in many countries' contexts, but if you go back to the roots, which is really the most important part of our discussion today, both symbolically and actually, going back to the roots of something, indigenous comes from two terms: in, which in every language means from, and gene, which means to give life. So indigenous, the direct translation from its original French Latin meaning, means to spring to life, which I think is quite a beautiful symbol of both what indigenous people are to this world and what we need to learn from our indigenous brothers and sisters. So thinking about the intersection between indigenous knowledge, rights of nature, we've also talked a bit about religion and now climate change. In my faith tradition, we believe that all of mankind came from the dust of the earth. And at the end of this life, we'll go back to the dust of the earth. So there's a kind of life cycle and a memory encapsulated in humankind that if we tap into, we'll unlock knowledge about the world we live in and also how humans should live in the world. We have a lot of expertise on our panel today. Expertise comes in many forms: formal education, lived experience, living with the land. I'm really honored that Vanda Watoto would join us from her indigenous community in the Amazon, and honored that Arnie Psyche would also join us from the Pacific Theological College to share some of his knowledge as well. So we'll start with some brief presentations from our two panelists and then go into a discussion about this life, this memory of life that's encapsulated in the indigenous soul and what we need to learn from the indigenous in order to respond to the demands of climate change. So Arnie, over to you.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes, okay. So, hello, my name is Arnie Psyche. I'd like to welcome you all this morning with a deep breath and a stretch, and thank the IF20 organizers for inviting me to participate and to introduce myself and the work that I am doing with Pacific Theological College on resilience and ecological accounting. Last week, the Pacific Festival, the largest celebration of Indigenous Pacific Islanders, took place for the first time in Hawaii. In a side event, the Protecting Oceania Conference took place addressing issues around militarization, indigeneity, and struggles against extractive industries, resource depletion, and neoliberal privatization. It was organized by friends and colleagues, including PTC, the Pacific Theological College. I was planning on addressing the Pacifica issues here, but I suspect that in the context of the Amazon, you will already know them. Even though I am in a different place with a different name, I think it is the same struggle against the same face. I'm director of Intemperate Earth, a nonprofit that is addressing national accounting issues from the perspective of ecological, economic accounting, and local data sovereignty. People ask, what is Intemperate? What is intemperate accounting? I'll talk about this more later, but the word intemperate means sacred or sacrosanct. And I choose that word because of its association to describe Immaculate Conception and the miracle of the virgin birth. Intemperate is something you cannot put a monetary price on, and this is how we should value nature and our ecological biodiversity, treating it as something that is sacrosanct. I am also a curriculum writer and teaching at Pacifica Communities University in Fiji. This course is part of an accredited degree program in the School of Sustainability and Resilience Development. And it intersects community consultation with indigenous and customary Pacifica epistemologies deeply rooted in decolonization and self-determination. This program was developed to prepare graduates with a professional degree that will help transition Pacifica economies towards resilience and sustainability. In yesterday's Paths to Prosperity panel, it was excellent that there was a recognition of this need of data and its relationship to the bioeconomy. Patricia Gomez said it was impossible to have investment without data, but my presentation demands that we recognize who the stewards of this data should be. So to some, this presentation might be very disruptive, and if it is, I hope this presentation expresses why it should be. National accounting systems influence global economics, yet activism against these systems has been minimal. The UN Statistical Division's lack of Global South representation must change. Historically, national accounting evolved to justify the expansion of empires. It was national accounting that justified the oppression of women, slavery, and genocide. National accounts are used in trade statistics, currency valuation, war statistics, weapons development, and it should be common knowledge by now that those who control national accounting systems control the global economic system. What I propose is that by integrating well-being, environmental sustainability, and social equity into national accounts, we can transform both ecological and economic systems. How we account for our ecology is as much about ecological justice as it is about economic justice. This realization was a revelation for me. It underscored the profound influence of national accounting systems on global power dynamics and social injustices. Yet, despite the critical importance of these systems, there was not a lot of activist campaigning directed at the UN system of national accounts, where this system is harmonized. PTC and the senior advisor at Pacific Island Forum Secretariat both responded to this accounting disconnect, and we began developing this program. At that time, the ecological accounting program was central to the development of the Blue Pacific Framework. However, shifts towards neoliberal data accumulation have since emerged. The Pacific Conference of Churches also embraced this work and included it in the Reweaving the Ecological Map program. And it was through a series of intensive discussions with regional and community leaders that this work was supported. They published my book, Ecological Economic Accounts Towards Intemperate Values, which I plan to rewrite to include the village consultations and the curriculum. In one of the remote village consultations, we discussed the value of ancestral bones. It was inconceivable that anyone would try to put a value on their bones or try to own them or to manage them. Bones are sacred. They have an intemperate value, recognizing that there is a deep cumulative knowledge, like a past, present, and future, going back to their own creation stories with genealogies that are so rich in data that protecting this data had to become the primary focus. Losing indigenous data to data transparency initiatives being written into legally binding trade agreements could lead to over $100 trillion theft if we consider that is what the World Bank has valued natural capital at. And when I say 100 trillion, I must let that sink in. If 1 trillion is 1,000 billion, then a trillion is also a million million. So if we consider natural capital as being valued at $100 trillion, that is, I think, 100,000 billion. And after that, I just lose count. And so while this number is so big and so incomprehensive, what happens when we apply this number to national debt? The United States has a $36 trillion public debt. The combined OECD economies have a $64 trillion debt. The rest of the G77 have a combined debt of maybe 45 trillion, and the Africa, Caribbean, Pacific region with the lowest development index have a combined debt of under $2 trillion. These are the kinds of trillions we are talking about. And so when it comes to ecological accounting and the value of natural capital, I cannot help but wonder if natural capital estimates are being measured against our national debts. And it's okay if it is, as long as we understand the valuation process. But if we do not know that data accumulation is equal to wealth accumulation, then we are prey to become victim to yet another resource theft. When we consider that data, especially an ecological economic accounting, should be entered and accounted only once to ensure accuracy and reliability, we must understand that this principle prevents inflation or distortion of values, which is crucial for creating a true representation of ecological and economic interactions. Double counting can occur when the same data point is recorded multiple times across different categories or sectors. For example, if carbon sequestration by forests is counted in both the forestry and carbon offset sectors, it can lead to an overestimation of carbon sequestration capabilities. So if we do not own our data, and national accounting systems adopt this kind of a national accounting program, we will quickly be priced out of benefiting from our ecological stewardship, and our access to wealth and infrastructure and development capabilities will be no different from what they are now, except worse, because we lost the opportunity to equalize how we value our environmental data. Hence, the G20 is precisely the forum to be discussing this in. When we consider the biodiversity of the Amazon, like our own Pacifica region, and the entire interconnectedness of our planet, we see a creation that is wonderfully benevolent, violently robust, and immaculately conceived. Its very existence is the true work of the divine that is measurable but resists monetary valuation. The Amazon rainforest, for instance, is a testament to nature's ability to create and sustain life in its most diverse and complex forms. Our oceans, covering the majority of the Earth's surface, are teeming with life and are critical to regulating our climate and supporting marine ecosystems. How we interact with our environment, recognizing its sacredness and inherent value, is what we must speak and live by. This means advocating for policies that protect and preserve our natural world and rethinking our economic systems to prioritize sustainability and ecological health. It requires a fundamental shift in how we view our relationship with nature, from one of domination and exploitation to one of mutual aid and reciprocity. Since 1972, the concept of the rights of nature has been incorporated into legislation, court rulings, and constitutional amendments in several countries. Ecuador was the first, I believe, to constitutionally recognize these rights, stating that nature has the right to integral respect for its existence and maintenance of its life cycles. I'm not an attorney, but I often hear about court rulings that favor the environment, but that there is a lack of enforcement that renders decisions ineffective, highlighting the need for robust mechanisms to uphold these legal victories. We also hear about binding trade agreements where states can impose sanction power to enforce the rights of corporations over the rights of people and the environment. So while the rights of nature have been recognized legally in various jurisdictions, why is there a lack of enforcement to bring violators to justice? Without government commitment and robust enforcement frameworks, court rulings in favor of nature seem to be easily ignored, undermining the very purpose of these progressive laws. And while I want to say that the true potential of the rights of nature can only be realized when legal victories are supported by strong enforceable actions, enforcement will only occur when there is economic incentive and a pathway for economic justice. The same needs to be said about Indigenous peoples' hard-won right for the legal recognition of free, prior, and informed consent. Until there is a strong enforcement mechanism to bring violators to justice, these rights remain aspirational. So how should we understand the rights of nature? Are there mechanisms of enforcement that can recognize these rights? Now, what if there's an accounting equation and a financial index that accounted for the interactions of our survival, solidarity, and stewardship, an accounting framework that measures our human interactions? What if there is a framework that gives value to our knowledge and action rather than on commodity prices that will further displacement? What if we could account, manage, and steward our ecological data with our own methodologies and work with Indigenous or local auditors to keep our data private and out of the hands of international investment consortiums? What if we can utilize free, prior, and informed consent to determine how we participate or not participate in translocal data markets that encourage communities to truly participate in mutual aid and assist in the use of financial instruments to assist at-risk communities? What if there was a bank that underwrote this index and helped to provide a facility where local data sovereignty can become a system for global equity in the global south, as well as an instrument for Indigenous, migrant, poor, or other at-risk communities to access wealth and infrastructure? And what if we could develop and use our own tools to measure, analyze, and quantify our data according to our own development priorities, rather than rely on expensive surveillance and monitoring technologies developed by departments of defense? So while ecological accounting opens opportunities for the economies of the global south, it is not an automatic win, but rather a strategy to level the playing field. Recent revisions to the UN National Accounting System have shown that adding or revising aggregates, such as the inclusion of military systems, research and development, and the digital economy, along with efforts to incorporate environmental and sustainability factors into economic measurements, create significant economic advantages over the global south. So to be clear, interim accounting doesn't seek to disrupt the bioeconomy. What it addresses is the need to revise how we account for our interactions with the environment against the production, consumption, distribution, and exchange of goods and services. Yesterday, Fabiola Barros gave a wonderful example highlighting the kind of stewardship in her agroforestry presentation, integrating short, medium, and long-term cycles while providing food for markets. I made a few copies of the Intemerate Earth white paper that outlines the accounting plan in more detail. What we do is we compare what we call environmental default swaps with several other data financing models like cost-based valuation, income approach, market-based valuations, and some others. And hopefully we will soon be launching a proof of concept program to show how this would function as claimed. The white paper addresses how Intemerate accounting values local data sovereignty, provides for translocal data markets, collective mutual accounting, how environmental default swaps can integrate with debt suspension or deferment, mitigation projects, food and water security, cross-border collaborations, and more. So what we did was invert the traditional approach of using a baseline as a reference point from which we measure deviations that move away from a given value. Instead, we measure towards the baseline. The baseline represents the target values or the ideal state we aim to achieve. This approach shifts our perspective when it comes to measuring values because it creates an index where people can plot their own values according to their own needs rather than trying to harmonize variations from a preset standard. So from a monetary perspective, it is this baseline that can financialize our interactions with the environment rather than commodify nature within the capitalist mindset of wealth accumulation and privatization. Intemerate accounting, or rather the intemerate baseline, provides a tangible shift to the way we think about value. The white paper also addresses how insurance issuers, like the New Development Bank, for example, can underwrite programs not through conflict models like Lloyd's of London, for example, but by aligning with good practical applications of environmental and social governance and responsibility, paving the way for this new paradigm in development that we've been talking about for the last 20 years. Whether ESG investors will support local practitioners and communities to be the holders of this equity has yet to be seen, but geopolitically, if we are to take seriously our motivations to restore our ecological biodiversity and provide communities to mitigate against climate change impacts on their own terms, environmental markets need coherent and strong regulatory governance. And that is not something that can happen under an accounting framework driven by data wealth accumulation. So in conclusion, as I mentioned in my introduction, our issues are in different places and have different names and different processes, but it is the same struggle against the same face. Together, let us revise the accounting framework by building market solidarity with our own accounting protocols and methodologies. And this is the nugget that we hold. It is more valuable than gold. It is intemerate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arnie. That encompasses, I think, first and foremost, philosophy, which is how do we measure the worth of an acquired worth? In economy, we're thinking about acquired worth. We're thinking about monetizing the worth that something accumulates as it moves from a natural resource to a finished product, right? That's the fundamental definition of GDP. But I think what Arnie's pointing at is flipping that entire process of worth accumulation on its head and saying instead that there is intemerate worth, meaning inherent, sacred. We don't accumulate value as we become closer to the product line. We accumulate value as we move closer to our roots and closer to what it means to be human and alive, which in the context of the indigenous is to be close to a land, to a place, and to a people. I think it's also interesting, Arnie, you've touched on some themes of resilience. Resilience as, in my mind, a key defining attribute of what it means to be or belong to an indigenous group. Resilience to maybe push back against, as you've mentioned, Arnie, some of the structural and monetary standards that have been set artificially by the global north or by the Western world, but also resilience to live in increasingly difficult and complex times. I'm also hearing some interesting thoughts about knowledge and data. What knowledge have we lost from the world? We talk so much about technological development. We talk about we have more resources than we've ever had in our lives, but actually I think we may have less resources than we've ever had because we've lost the knowledge of the indigenous. We've lost traditions from our ancestors about how to live the land and not just exploit the land, but to live in harmony with the earth, to live in harmony with Mother Earth. What knowledge have we lost? I hope, Vanda, you'll touch on that core theme. And lastly, the difference between knowledge and data. I did a quick search to see how frequently the word data has been used in the last 100 years. As it turns out, it's a product of the 1950s. Data was not a term used in the global lexicon until about 1950. Knowledge has been used for thousands of years. So what's the difference between data and knowledge? Data is singular, it's finite, it's a moment in time, it's a statistic. It doesn't grow or move or change. It's a single point on a map. Knowledge, the core definition of knowledge, is experience. Knowledge is alive, breathing, growing. It's not a single moment, it's moments. It's a collective, it's a group. And I think even in that differentiation, we can start thinking about how we account for what we know and not just the data that we have. So without further ado, turning the time over now to Vanda to teach us more about indigenous knowledge in the age of climate change. Vanda, to you.
Oi.
Hello.
Naraivanda. Saúdo a todos na língua
I
bui.
salute you all in the language Abui, the language that was spoken by our ancestors. I salute Adriana, this Black woman from the Terreiro. I salute everybody present, and I want to sing for our grandparents.
Bidu, boi naima, bidu, hitoma, bidu. Anana enyo, boi nainyo, aru, bija ipika, kaipona, bidu. Do. Eu sou uma mulher indígena, pertencente ao povo Witoto, e vou
I'm an
trazer
indigenous woman from the Itoto people, and I will start speaking from the voices of the people
dentro da cultura indígena,
from my culture. Inside my indigenous culture, historically, we are matriarchs,
processo colonial,
but due to a colonial process,
religioso,
religious process,
nossas mulheres foram
our women have been silenced
e não temos
in history. We don't have them in the registration.
da mesa, né, que foi proposta,
In this perspective,
tecer algumas
I try to have some contributions
e da ancestralidade das mulheres
from the fight and ancestrality
na Amazônia.
of the women Witoto in Amazon.
São originalmente da Colômbia, de Chorreiro,
Witoto are from Colombia,
é a região que
from Chorreiro and Putumayo.
minha tata, minha bisavó
It's where my great-grandmother, my great-great-great-grandmother were born.
se deslocar fugitiva para o Brasil no período
They tried, they had to move forcibly to Brazil
1930, foi o período
on the
que o povo ficou
period of exploration. My people were fleeing
no Rio
due
Amazonas,
to the
de Amaturá, que é onde o meu território
to the smudge exploration,
margem do Rio Solimões, a aldeia
and from the Solimões margin,
slide, por
the
favor.
Colonia
Hoje eu vivo
people
no Parque das Tribos,
had to flee. I live
bairro reconhecido dentro da
I live now in a neighborhood in Manaus.
anos, o Parque das Tribos se tornou símbolo
The
resistência
Park of Tribes is a symbol from the Manaus capital because the state in Brazil, they don't recognize the presence of indigenous peoples outside their territory. So this is the first neighborhood that is acknowledged by the public power as a first indigenous land. We have 700 families, 30 different peoples, and 14 languages spoken. The images that you're seeing are taken by me since 2016. I'm the first woman of my people to attend university. This mechanism of reaching the academic space in the university, it enabled us from the quotes system to allow Black and Indigenous people to reach university. We were not allowed to reach this academic space. And even though our peoples are entering these spaces, our knowledge is not acknowledged. We reach that space and our knowledge stay outside from the door out. It is a big fight for our bodies that are present there. It is tough. We know, we have knowledge of a science that can solve the problems of our humankind. When we approach from this point of view, I've been trying to have a work as a climate activist, defending life and nature, because we understand each other as nature. The main fight for indigenous peoples is for the land, for the right of keeping existing and connecting with our living rivers. A lot of our rivers in some territories, like from the Munduruku people, they are contaminated by mercury. And Amazonia is being looked from the capital price and not due to their value. The Amazon is considered an economical asset to the world. We look into our region because it is where we have living forests. We have an abundance of rivers, but we are endangered due to the exploitation of nature as its natural resource. When we look at nature as a resource, we're talking about capital, we're talking about money. So this nature is an economic object for the capitalism. And this exploration from oil mining that is advancing in the Amazon River, and our state has political leaders enabling the weakening of laws, approving bidding of potassium and gold in indigenous lands. I salute Mura leaderships, one of the most impacting territories of potassium explorations. Can we have the slides, please? We have Território Parque das Tribos. This neighborhood is a symbol of resistance and fight for public policies in a city. We are in this region. This territory for 8 years had no access to water. Inside Manaus, with the biggest water supply, this population did not have access to treated water, did not have power, kids didn't have schools, and they were not served in the health system inside the community. We went through the pandemic on this exact conditions. We had no water. The formal guideline was to wash our hands as soon as we touched something, and we had no treated water. We had an irregular well for our survival. We received water once a week during the pandemic. and we did not have any basic sanitation for up to 2021. And then I get myself thinking, the indigenous knowledge that is brought to some debates, they are vital. Some organizations are looking into these knowledge as something to be considered when tackling climate change. When I see scientists, environmental scientists, speaking about what our grandparents, talking things that our grandparents mentioned thousands of years ago. What the Western world is orienting now is the same that our indigenous grandparents said. But are our pieces of knowledge being considered? What our elders have been saying, are you considering that? Are you appropriating that knowledge? Because we can see an appropriation of this knowledge by scholars, but no acknowledgement of the knowledge of our people. Our technologies, our ancestral knowledge that is enough to tackle climate change because we are marginalized by the public power. We are a part of climate financing with all the impacts that we have with social and economical inequality that is imposed on indigenous lands, ribeirinhos, quilombolas in the Amazon and in the country. But these technologies that are inside our territory, these technologies that enable us to live without treated water, because throughout the riverbeds, we have a lot of communities without treated waters. We have children dying because they don't have treated water. When we're fighting for the right for nature, for the right of nature as a living being, those are the peoples that consider earth, the forest, the wind, birds, as beings that have a soul and are living. Rivers are a living being for our people. We can see the life on those lands, but the lawmakers don't consider that. Our governance, our mayors, our state representatives don't have this relationship. So all the fighting mechanisms to preserve and care are undone because the people occupying these positions of power are making the laws, like the National Congress, as we're speaking. Amazon last year had the biggest draw of the last 100 years, and we have another one forecasted. In the south, we had the biggest flood ever documented. And in our Congress, we are approving and advancing laws that are weakening environmental protection. Us, as Brazilian society, we have a huge responsibility on who we are putting on those positions of power, because for indigenous peoples, we are in a huge fight. For those who believe that rivers are living, that the forest is living, those have to occupy these positions of power so we can acknowledge nature as a living being that must be protected, that must be cared for. So for us, women, Witoto women, indigenous women, we have an important front. We are saying we are earth women. Earth is our body. The earth is just like our body, that when you plant seeds, we can generate life. Women are earth. We generate life. And the earth, when you place seeds in it, is where you plant forests, is what enables thousands of species, what feeds and cures us. This is the relations that our grandparents have taught us many years ago.
My people is in this territory, the Colunia village. My people is illiterate. They don't study in schools and universities, but they are literate in handling and taking care of the nature. No school, even if it's the most fancy in the world, they have the knowledge and wisdom these peoples have. The technologies of care that our indigenous people have been using for thousands of years, just like Davi Kopenawa said, are responsible so that the sky won't fall over our heads from our singing, from how we plant our crops for food, how our prayers to our gods, to our goddesses are these technologies that keeps us alive, that makes us resist for over 5 centuries of violence and colonization and exploration, because that's what we have been facing up to now. My generation is still a generation that cannot live fully. My generation is still fighting for survival so that the territory can survive, so that the river can survive, so we can dive and have fish from our rivers. We are a generation that is not able to live fully. We don't even have time to dance our sacred singing. We don't have time to be in our collectives because we gotta be here outside saying that we are alive, saying that we exist in our territories. We need to go to walks in Brasilia to tell the governors of this country that nature, that the territory has to be set limits, has to be protected. These challenges are the ones that we face in our peoples. And we want the organizations, the society as a whole, to get united, because if only us, the indigenous people, fight for it, we're not going to be able to stop this exploration of the land. We won't be able alone to make it. We need the engagement of everyone in this big fight. Because when we fight for the earth, it's not only for our lives, it's for the lives of mankind. Because the rivers, taking care of rivers and forest is taking care of the planet. So I thank you for the opportunity to provoke and bring these memories, because our grandparents are in the territories depending of life quality for them. They depend on food. They have been observing that with this heating of the earth, our crops won't produce enough food. The roots and the seeds, they dry in the land because also the warmth. This is incredible to hear from the indigenous women in Rio Negro and Solimões, that the earth, because it's so hot, it's killing the worms that serve as a fertilizer. The earth is tough. The seeds that are planted, they won't grow. What are we effectively doing to face this? Because we've been facing this fight in this it's not an equal way, and we create values. So how could humanity create a value for gold that won't feed us, won't collaborate for the life on earth? Why did the society put a value to something that kills the rivers? Because the countries, the world banks, about they measure their value in how much gold they have we as a mankind won't create other values from nature, but this is not the market value of carbon that's coming to the world, and it's not impacted to our people. But how can we actually see a value as a life from a living forest, a living river, a fertile land that is going to feed us and heal us? We need to create values for the nature. And gold should not have so much value because gold has so much value, our rivers going to be threatened, our lands are going to be threatened, because this is the world that the world has. Whoever has more gold has power and value in this earth, and we need to create other types of values from nature. The countries who have their living forest, these will be actually a country with a value in a market, not because of the amount of gold this country has, because otherwise we are going to be extincted. My people is an ant people. If we die, we're going to be like an ant, regardless of what happens on this earth. We will be birds. We will have seeds for tobacco. We are gonna have seeds for coca, because this is what we believe we came from based on our beliefs. And you, where are you going? Where will you be? And the other people, we are looking for, with our efforts, our generation, our knowledge, our kids, our grandparents. We have been looking for for a long time, this care for the earth. And this is the call to action that we have. Let's us recognize we are nature, let's fight for it so that we can survive. Haririkwe, thank you.
You have given us many gifts today. The first, you've given the gift of your expertise. The second, you've given us the gift of your soul. And certainly every person in this room feels the urgency of your message and the cries of your heart and the cries of the indigenous people. I run an organization that responds to genocide. There's no question in my mind that there is genocide against the indigenous people. It is the silent genocide that's being disguised as other issues in the world. I was thinking while Vanda was sharing, for example, about COP28, a conference where all of the richest countries in the world are paying obscene prices to talk about climate. Why don't we have Indigenous 28? Why are we not gathering the people of the world to talk about the people, the lives, the knowledge that we are losing? Instead, we have monetized all things, and we have lost the value of the earth as a result. I want to share a quick metaphor, and then we'll go into questions and answers. We just have a few moments for that. For most of my early life, I worked with clay, ceramic clay, and I was taught how to throw clay bowls on a wheel. Clay comes from the earth, that goes without saying, but the earth has memory. Vanda was telling this, and it's an important reminder to remember that the earth has a memory. And clay is where I first learned this lesson. As you're throwing a bowl on the wheel, if you bump the bowl, if you accidentally hit the bowl so that it's no longer circular and round, the clay remembers the movement. So even if you correct, as you're creating the bowl, as you correct that mistake, and you put it in the kiln and you fire the bowl, when it comes out, that bump will be there. It's retained in the memory of the clay. And so it is with the earth. The violence, the exploitation, and the genocide committed against the earth is in the memory of the earth. And one of my favorite psychologists, Dr. Brene Brown, she talks about how in order to restore something, an apology and acknowledgement is not enough. We must make amends. Just like this clay, Apology may change the shape temporarily, but without amends, in order to resolve this bump in the bowl, you have to take it off the wheel and you have to recreate the memory of the clay in order to resolve those mistakes that you've made. How do we restore and recreate the memory of the earth? Well, if we build on the teachings of the indigenous that the earth is alive and it's a relationship that we must have, you can only make amends with a person by restoring trust. The earth needs to trust mankind. Mankind needs to trust the earth. How do we make those amends? This is my first question for both of you. How do we restore trust with the earth after the many mistakes that have been made, after the centuries of colonialism, as you mentioned, Vonda, exploitation, lack of transparency, as you've mentioned, Arnie, the violence? How do we make amends with our Mother Earth and restore trust in the age of climate change? Thoughts?
Well, as you could anticipate, my approach to this might be number one, indigenous, but number two, also economic. Part of restoring is accounting for our restoration, accounting for rehabilitation, for remediation. All of these things have an economic cost. And so when we're speaking about GDP, as you mentioned, there's another factor that is not included with GDP, which is well-being. And so W for well-being. So if you were to modulate well-being with our GDP, you would get an entirely different number. And our well-being has everything to do with how we restore, how we remediate, how we replenish, and that would be the sort of economic, ecological answer to your statement.
Vonda, thoughts on how we make amends with our earth, recreating the memory of our earth?
Bom, eu
Well, we come from a process that is colonial from schools. We are graduated in these schools, in the academy, to occupy the economical spaces so that we can have a job. And when I observe my experience in school as an indigenous kid, it brought me far from my culture, from my language, from my thinking that used to connect me with this earth. And this process, inside the process of teaching in the West, science says the human being is something, and nature is something else distant from this human being. So we have a culture because when we study, we develop a culture. So we have a culture related to not recognize ourselves as part of nature. We don't do that. We don't recognize as something that belongs to nature. And when I understood in an exercise that I had to connect me with the memories of my grandparents, that because of this violence and for having the need to flee from their ancestral territory to survive in another country, which is Brazil, my grandparents were forbidden to speak their language. And when there is this removal of the language from our peoples, we start thinking in a Western way also. And that's bringing us far from this belonging, this contemplating nature as a living being with soul, with spirit. And my people, my generation is exercising a lot and putting a lot of effort because of the time that is put over us, the speed of things, the way they happen, the big fight that still remains for us. We're trying to look for this belonging. We're trying to feel nature, taking a look at the river and ask for say, excuse me, I want to dive in the forest, because we understand that the forest is talking to us, saying a lot of things. So for us, today we have a work with the kids in this process of teaching them or educating them to motivate them so they can have self-esteem besides their own indigenous identity, because there's violence over us that makes many of us to feel ashamed of who we are. So today in our teaching, in our schooling, we have a huge effort to have self-esteem and belong to the earth, belong to nature, belong to these elements. Let us understand a type of ant, just like my people have already considered themselves. It's called saúva, this type of ant. So the effort that every one of us can put over everything is to get to know about the story of our elderly people. For me, this is the main innovation and technology to what we can have access to, these knowledges when we listen to our elderly people, so that we can have a generation. I don't have this perspective of uh, nature and humanity, because we did not create no type of global mechanism so that this actually happens, that we want to take care of nature. So my report is the experience of the huge effort, which is for us indigenous people to keep ourselves connected with the memories and the knowledge and wisdom of our elderly people. I don't have an apple pie recipe for us. How can we connect to our people? This is also a challenge for our people. It's a challenge for our people to have a school in Parque das Tribos, which is indigenous, because we have a Western school there, and they exert violence and they don't recognize our culture. So there is a huge challenge, and I'm not going to be able to give you an answer for this event, but I'm talking about the effort that we women, because we women share the knowledge with our kids. We are the ones with the responsibility and the effort before no structure at all, no support at all, so that our kids know that they are Yoto Chikuta Anano Mura, and our kids are supposed to feel their nature, because here we cannot dive in the rivers because they are contaminated. I cannot talk about the river. I have to take a bus and take kids to the only river, which is Igarapé das Águas Brancas. They have it's the only one that is living in Manaus, to tell the indigenous kids that they are river, that they are earth, that they can dive, because the rivers that goes through our cities are polluted. The river that is behind our community, we cannot dive there because it's full of oil. It's full of garbage. We have refrigerators, plastic bottles. So we have a huge challenge to see nature. So for us to recognize ourselves as nature is a challenge. So there's a structure that is imposed to us that brings us far from the nature, and that comes from education, that forms us as individuals, competitive, and we cannot fight together for the nature. So these are challenges, but I believe a lot that if these indigenous peoples who have always put themselves in a defense and a fight for the earth, if they also have spaces for decision making, for me, it's a huge strategy today for us indigenous people to look for through the occupation of these places of power. And when I say that, we're talking about politics, okay? For me, in my layness and this perception of the challenges of the society, I think that in these strategies to create mechanisms to protect the lives and the territories of indigenous people and also nature, it's done through the occupation of these spaces that we are going to make progress by creating legal mechanisms in the laws of our country so that we can make progress. Because as long as we are outsiders, like we are, we can only talk. We won't be able to create any mechanism so that what we believe can be in the agendas, be possible, and shown to the society as a cultural instrument where everybody can see. Otherwise, we will be still fighting.
Thank you. Todo obrigada for your words and for the experience. If I were to summarize this panel, I would say first and foremost that the urgency can be felt. It's visceral, it's tangible. Second, the first step to changing the memory of the earth, to changing the memory of violence that has plagued the earth and the indigenous people is acknowledgement, as you've mentioned, acknowledging the human dignity of all indigenous people, acknowledging the dignity of the land that we're sitting on today. I want to acknowledge that there are people whose memory is in the land where we are having this meeting right now. And then reconceptualizing both transparency and how we account for the value of earth and indigenous people, as Arnie mentioned, but also reconceptualizing education systems, as Vanda pointed to. We need to change the way we learn about the earth, from the earth, and with indigenous people to protect the earth. We have our action items cut out for us. Let me just say that one action item that I'll be taking as a result of this conversation today is thinking about how we can connect indigenous communities in Brazil to formal education systems and facilitating those relationships and networks so that those conversations can be had. And I hope that you'll hold me accountable to that. I'll hold myself accountable to that. I hope that each of you will also take action. If the words we've shared today stay in this room, we have failed. We have failed the privilege of sitting in this room. I hope we'll take the words that were shared and put them into action in our spheres of influence. So please join me again in thanking our panelists for a wonderful session.
We want to thank this wonderful panel and thank you so much for the words and everything. We're going to immediately go to our next panel discussion. We would invite Catherine Marshall and David Saperstein to come, and let's first take a quick picture, if we could, of this group before we start the next. If you could just come quickly take a picture. So go ahead. Thank you. It is an honor that we have our next guest. Our moderator for this next session will be Catherine Marshall, the Vice President of G20 Interfaith Forum. She is also the Senior Fellow at Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University, and also the Executive Director of World Faith Development Dialogue. Our speaker for this session will be David Saperstein, who is the former Ambassador at Large for Freedom of Religion for the United States under Obama, President Obama. We are so grateful to have him here. He is such a strong voice for freedom of religion internationally, but we're especially looking forward to his lecture today on environment sustainable development, and religious engagement, which is something that has been definitely a theme both in Belém, but also here in Manaus. So I will turn the time over to Catherine and David. Thank you so much.
I think it gave us both the feel and the information that we're looking for in trying to translate this. We're very lucky to have David Saperstein with us. And one thing we decided was that we would do this not as a lecture, though David could speak for 3 or 4 hours without difficulty, but as a conversation where we're grappling with the kinds of problems that are part of our daily lives today. David Saperstein is recognized in many settings as one of the most influential religious leaders in the United States and beyond. And he wears many different hats, but among them are about 40 years, something like that, with the largest Jewish organization in the United States. He served, as Mariana pointed out, as the ambassador for religious freedom in the Obama administration. So we still refer to him as ambassador if we don't refer to him as David. And he has a very long history, decades-long history of focusing on the issues of climate change and protection of the environment, including with the Interfaith Coalition on Energy, one of the very first efforts, but also the National Religious Partnership on the Environment. And among other issues that he works on are human trafficking, and I have the honor that he is the chair of the board of the NGO that I lead. So David is one of the people, I think, who sits at the real intersections between public policy and the understanding of the public and the roles that religion plays. So with that, let me start by asking David, after all the decades that you've worked on these issues, many different organizations, not only in the United States, but internationally, what do you see as the value added, to use a technical term? What is it that the religious dimensions in all their complexity bring to the challenges that we're talking about here in Manaus this week? What difference does it make, and how do you think about it conceptually?
Could you imagine if the entire world could have witnessed what we just heard a few minutes ago, or many of the messages here of the indigenous communities, not just what their needs are, but the powerful messages that they represent? How could they question what the value added of religion has the potential to be as we face this crisis? And I don't have to convince anyone who's in this room what an extraordinary crisis this is. If you look at the estimates of the pessimists, of the scientific experts who were pessimists, even up to a decade ago, things are spinning out of control so much faster than even the most dire predictions would be. As again, the UN's IPCC, that is the extraordinary panel of experts on this, is warning us that really, if we don't act, we are facing an existential crisis. And I give a lot of credit to the Secretary General for making this absolutely clear. He has said over and over again, this is not fiction or exaggeration, to quote him. It is what science tells us will result from our current energy policies. We're on a pathway to global warming more than double the Paris targets. More than double the parents, the targets, and he made it clear it's now or never. Unprecedented, to quote him again, unprecedented heat waves, terrifying storms, widespread water shortages, extinction of 1 million species of plants and animals. We have to act now, and if we are, it requires changing people, the way people live, and the Pope's admonition to get away from a consumer mentality of life. It requires changing institutions, economic institutions, cultural institutions, educational institutions, and it requires changing government policy. When it comes to changing people, the power of the religious community is significant, as it is in the other two categories as well. Think about this paradox. For the 80% of people who identify as religious, who identify with some faith entity in their lives, 80% of the world's population, according to the polls, of all of those, religion is both the most local way they organize their lives, beyond the family, here in their houses of worship across the globe, and the most global way they organize their lives. Many part of faith traditions that span the globe and bring together the global community. What enormous potential religion has. And think about it just pragmatically for a moment. Put aside all of the policies, all of the data, just think about it pragmatically. In the United States, there are more houses of worship than any other public building. You can add up the schools, the police stations, the libraries, the hospitals, and in total, they don't measure the number of the 340,000 houses of worship. There are estimates, we're talking 6 to 10 million houses of worship across the globe. Can you imagine if every single one of them took on a serious energy conservation policy, using wherever they could renewable energy, conserving energy of all kinds, building it, integrating it into their construction plans and the way they administer their buildings as time goes on, recycling, more importantly, purchasing recycled goods. Can you imagine if they mobilized their billions of worshipers, members, to actually be a powerful force for what increasingly the leadership of the faith traditions are talking about, and the enormous impact that that could have in this crisis. Each of our traditions, we just heard from a range over the last 2 days of indigenous traditions, but each of our faith traditions has their own contribution to add to this. Let me just speak for a moment of the Jewish tradition, because it's probably less known to many of you than most of the other major world faith traditions are. From the book of Psalms, we all know the line, the earth is the eternal's and the fullness thereof. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. In Judaism, that was understood to say that God has created all of the world and entrusted it to us, to our care. It is a trust. In the terms of any trust, economic or any trust of value, first above all is to protect the corpus of the trust and to use it as the originator of the trust instructs us to use it. And in my tradition, that means sharing God's wealth with those of God's children who are poorer, more vulnerable, who need our help. In the Jewish tradition, charity, there's no word for charity. It's not a question of caritas or philanthropy, love of our fellow person. It is tzedakah, it is righteousness, it is a commandment that you must share God's wealth with those who are less fortunate than are we. And that kind of thinking here led to 2,000 years ago, when Jesus of Nazareth walked on earth, led in the Talmud to the creation of a system of governmental rules and regulations in the Jewish community that protected water, that protected the air, that addressed pollution, that called for non-wasting of resources from the lines in Deuteronomy. Here, Bal Tashkit, do not waste. Beginning in wartime, you can't waste, destroy fruit-bearing trees. You've got to fight war in a way that allows normal life to renew itself afterwards. But by the Talmud, that meant you didn't waste anything frivolously. You had to care about resources. The Muslim community, a number of scholars recently issued a major statement called Al-Mizan, which refers to balance in how we use God's resources. And that idea, Maimonides, the greatest of the medieval Jewish scholars, said we have to use everything entrusted to us in moderation. It can't be excessive. Here, that's not being responsible to what God has for us. So, and think about the sabbatical year. You had to let the land rest and renew itself at least every 7 years. You canceled all debts every 7 years, gave people a chance to renew themselves and to start again. The Jubilee year commandment, that land has to go back to the original owners, something that speaks across the millennia to us today as well. So there's this array of our particular laws, but you look at Laudato Si, you look at Laudate Deum, the Pope's encyclicals on the environment. They are so powerful. I refer to Al-Mizan, and there are counterparts in the Buddhist and Hindu world as well, as more and more leaders are speaking out. So these are powerful moral visions that can help transform the debate. And the question is, why have we failed to do better than we have? But the potential for that and the impact it does have, even though not as much as we might want, but that it actually does have, and many of you are responsible for that around this table, is still an inspiring hope for humankind.
Thank you, David. I think you've given a very powerful answer to this question of what's religion got to do with this global crisis, giving us both the sense of the size and the scope, but also the nature of the teaching. We've heard quite a bit this morning about data, and you've referred to some of the data, but we also know that what really influences people is stories. And it would be very helpful if you could give us a couple of practical examples of where you see a real actual and potential action role that the religious communities play.
Well, I mean, if I asked each of you the question, could you think of something that you have been involved in which you have seen the religious community do something to successfully address some environmental problem? How many of you could raise your hands here around the table that you've seen, you or been part of this yourself? Almost every person here, Catherine. So here we could go around the table and learn from each other in fascinating ways about the breadth that we have. There are so many that I think of here when the religious community weighed in on the renewal of endangered species legislation protecting in the United States and in countries like Indonesia and other countries where the religious communities weighing in really made a difference, in part because that's such an intuitively religious issue. You're protecting creation in a literal sense, not in a macro sense, but in a very defined sense when we talk about protecting endangered species. So that's one example. I think the one that I'm most proud of that we should come back and talk about a little bit more at some here when we move to sustainable development is the role that the religious communities played in many of our countries and at COP. And I can tell you directly in the United States Congress in ensuring that environmental justice be a part of any solution that we have. That the poorest countries of the world, the ones that did the least to create this problem, are the countries suffering the most from the impact of environmental change in the short run, although it will affect all of us in the long run. They are the least equipped to adapt to new technologies. They are the least equipped to mitigate the impact of it. And one of the reasons that COP increasingly made this an issue was the role of the religious voices pushing for that. I can tell you in the first major bill in the United States that was introduced to address climate change did not have a single line in it about concern about the poor. And the religious communities went in. They're convinced, Henry Waxman, convinced Senator Warner. Here, the Warner meeting was so incredible. It was supposed to be a 10-minute meeting. The chair of the committee is supposed to be a 10-minute meeting. This has now appeared in books, the story of this. There, he got so engaged about the religious messages that we were talking about here, that he remained for an hour asking questions about all the religious teachings, and at the end of that said, you know what, I was wrong to leave this out. I'm going to be sure that this goes into the legislation. And there are variants that I think have happened across the globe on this. God's pervasive preference for the poor, to ensure that the most vulnerable of God's children will be cared for, is our responsibility as we address this. I think it's one of our great contributions. But let me just mention quickly two more. One in Indonesia, which on the islands like Sumatra and Kalimantan, there really are terrible practices to slash and burn. The government says it shouldn't be allowed, but they don't enforce it. Here, the amount of land that is being destroyed there is just enormous. And the Islamic leaders, this is the largest Islamic country in the world, 90% of the population is Islamic. The Islamic leaders got together and a fatwa council, the Ulama Council of Indonesia, issued a fatwa first to say it is forbidden to destroy endangered species to the point of extinction. That must stop as a religious command. And then 2 years later, that was in 14, 2 years later in 16, here 2016, they came out saying slash and burn, the cutting down randomly of the old growth forest and then the burning of everything left in its path was absolutely haram, absolutely forbidden under Islamic law, and eventually it pushed the government to take more significant steps. Not as much as we would have wanted, but it had a direct impact in improving the situation. And one here from Brazil, the Yanomami Indian tribes up in the northwest in Venezuela and northwest Brazil, and the gold mining that was done there, you know, flooded in the 60s and 70s and 80s with illegal miners, finally cracked down. They were theoretically forced out, but under the Bolsonaro administration, there was still 25,000 illegal miners there. And the process of mining the gold and sifting through it puts enormous heavy metal contamination, particularly mercury, so that they are exposed at levels far beyond the other segments of the Brazilian population. Here between 2020 and 2023, 570 kids died as a result of exposure to heavy metals. And Cardinal Leonardo took this really strong strong position about this, drawing on Pope Francis's writings in Laudato Si to really organize the bishops to speak out against it, to act against it, invest money in helping the populations there, and finally, under the current administration, has really begun to really crack down on the illegal mining going on there. So, you know, a range of different kinds of causes and examples where I think the religious community really has made a significant difference and can make a lot more. We have more power than we think we do. And let me ask you a question here. You're kind of our resident expert on religion and sustainable development, which is so crucial to deal with this on a broader level here. If I ask you the same question about the religious value, the religious added value in terms of sustainable development, drawing on your decades of experience at the World Bank and heading World Faith Development Dialogue, how would you respond?
Well, my first comment is that what has seemed to many of us a very obvious link between the worlds of religion and the worlds of development, humanitarian aid, peace building, etc., has actually been much more difficult than any of us had predicted. And we've asked ourselves many questions why. Some of it is the assumption for a long time, which is clearly untrue, that with development, religion becomes less important and less of an influence. The second is people may see the religious, spiritual as something very personal that doesn't have much to do with politics or power. We know that that's not true. There's also quite negative associations with religion in many settings, particularly violence. And a lot of these are well debunked in many settings, but they still influence many of the people who are writing reports and so forth. But the positive side, which is of course where we're focused, I'd like to think it's seen by more and more people that if you look at these sustainable development goals that the United Nations approved in 2015 unanimously, there are 17 goals, 169 targets. In every single one of them, there is a religious dimension, whether it is water or infant mortality, early childhood education, the protection of the environment. In every single case, there is a religious dimension. But those religious dimensions have often not been clearly defined. And so one of the challenges which we're seeing here in Manaus this week is to try to find ways to link what is the public policy and the politics with the strength and the power of the religious communities. And one example we'll be talking about later this week is the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, which the G20 Interfaith has focused on for at least the last 6 to 7 years as a remarkable example of religious communities coming together, including in ways that are not always easy, the indigenous perspectives in trying to address the issue of the lungs of the earth, these rainforests. So, but we have literally hundreds of examples, some of them very unlikely. For example, garbage collection, recycling, all of these. And it does range from advocacy, changing people's hearts and minds and behavior, giving them stories that will actually make them think, that they can teach their children, all the way to very practical examples of modeling and leading the way.
You know,
but I think, yeah.
I would also add that you talk about the good things about religion and where religion is seen as creating problems is because of different gender roles. in some of our religious communities, the question, the commitment in the SDG 5 to the equality of women in every way becomes a place where the religious community really can make a difference, and the environmental issues we're talking about have a direct impact. I mean, first of all, one of the best things we can do to enhance economies, to help control population levels, to